Hello, USHAPers. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Miss CG, and I'm one of the 3 USHAP teachers this year. And I'm going to be leading you through your asynchronous lesson today. So we're going to be talking about the Treaty of Paris. We'll do a little recap there. But our big focus are going to be on Republican Motherhood and the Articles of Confederation. So really trying to answer that question of to what extent were they effective. Note that with your reading response, you're also going to get some more info on Republican Motherhood there as well, which is great because this is one of the concepts that students tend to struggle with on the AP test, so more is better. So that's what we're going to be running through today. Do make sure that you're keeping up with your fluency fact cards, especially your card for Republican Motherhood and the articles. And then we're going to finish up with some practice, so you'll have some thesis practice on your teacher's Canvas page, so be on the look for that. So first we want to recap the Treaty of Paris of 1783, not to be confused with other treaties of Paris. There are quite a few. So the big ideas here, so we send our big 3, John Jay, Ben Franklin, and John Adams, to negotiate for us in Paris with Great Britain. And the biggest sticking point was over our independence, which to us, that was the entire point of all of this. So they just keep going round and round and round. And finally, they do capitulate, not really because of any kind of negotiation that's going on, but that other battles are being lost around the world, and Britain is really feeling the pressure. And so they finally do capitulate. This is going to pave the way for more westward expansion. Remember the proclamation of 1763 that was designed to be this buffer between the tribal lands of the different Indian tribes and our colonists. So this is going to open up the Mississippi River in particular. So this is the Northwest Territory. Remember, Northwest Territory is Ohio, not Portland. So those are our regions there. So Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So the Northwest expansion is going to double the size of our tiny nation. So upside for Great Britain, they don't have to foot the bill anymore, and they've got a pretty solid trading partner in us. So they're getting some upsides here as well. The aftermath of the treaty, there's still going to be a lot of tension between these 2 major players, and this is going to continue for quite some time. Great Britain is refusing to relinquish their forts in the Northwest Territory. So even though they're leaving as a power, they still have people there. So soldiers are still going to be there. They're going to be arming the Native American tribes in this region as well. So as you can imagine, that doesn't go over terribly well. Patriots are confiscating territory from the Loyalists, even though the treaty specifically stipulated that that was not going to happen, but that happens anyway, happens to Quakers as well, because they weren't fighting because of their belief in pacifism. 1795, John Jay will have to return for Jay's Treaty because all of these issues are going to continue, and eventually we will have to fight a second war for independence, and that is the War of 1812. So these are going to be the continuation of those issues. So John Jay, a really important statesman for us as we continue. Optional, this is in your document that we've shared out with you today. So this is kind of the opposite side of what we've been talking about. So this is the opposite of Gordon Wood's thesis, that it was revolutionary. So you can check that out if you're interested. There's also a chart there if you want a little bit more practice. All right, so this is the point where we shift into Republican Motherhood. So be a good piece of practice to go ahead and pause the recording now and think about, where have we seen women in our content thus far, and see if you can come up with a decent sized list. I've given you some hints on the slide here, so hopefully that helps a little bit. So this is what I would expect to see. So the fact that we have several matrilineal tribes, so tribes that define families through the mother versus the father, so that if you were to go marry into a family, you would move into the woman's home and not the father's. New England colonists are bringing women in families. So remember, this is different from what's going on in our southern colonies, where they have more of this focus on economy. Flip side of that is that because there aren't that many women in the South, they're going to have a lot more opportunity for rights. So sometimes this is referred to as the widowocracy in the South. So the idea that widows could run businesses and do all kinds of things that normally men would only be able to do in that particular society. Anne Hutchinson, she's a good name to remember. So remember, she's not getting along well with the Puritans and all of their rules. And so she is banished for her trouble, along with Roger Williams. Pocahontas, as always, not the Disney version. Great Awakening, you've got women. They're not testifying or preaching per se, but they definitely are participating. They're attending these revivals. We'll get to the Second Great Awakening next unit, and we'll definitely see more women being represented there. Slave women and their experience, female indentured servants, and matrilineal lines for slave women and their children. So hopefully you had more than a few of those on your practice list. All right, so I want to introduce you to Abigail Adams. This is from the John Adams series that HBO put together several years ago. So she's being played by Laura Linney, and she and John are having a heart-to-heart conversation about politics.
I understand people like Mr. Dickinson and his friends all too well, John. Send a woman to the Congress, she might knock some sense into it.
It's not a question of men and women, Abigail. It's a matter of politics.
Politics? And do women not live politics, John Adams? When I go to the company and I find no coffee, no sugar, no pins, no meat, am I not living politics? This war touches people that your Congress treats with the same contempt King George reserves for the people of Boston. I mean women, yes, and slaves too, for that matter. Though I'm sure you wish I would not mention that subject, as it might upset your Southern friends. I am cold.
So there you go. So there's an introduction to Abigail Adams. You can see that she just does not have much patience for John's system of politics. And an important reminder that women are playing a very big role in the revolution on the home front. The women are setting up boycotts, they're making homespun, things like that. So good pieces to remember there. Okay, so let's learn a little bit more about Abigail, because she's going to be writing him a letter that's really important for our purposes here. So she's self-taught, so she grows up in a family with a pretty extensive library. And so they teach her to read, her family does, and then she goes to town on the library and just reads as much as she can. She meets John when she's 17, and her parents insist on a long engagement, even though they wanted to get married right away. And so they're married 2 years later, so she's 19 and he's 28. They do end up having 6 children, but only 4 survive to adulthood. This is an issue that would have been facing virtually all colonial families during this time period. Outbreak of disease like smallpox is still a big concern, especially on frontier areas. So they're going to be settling in a town in Massachusetts called Braintree. And he's obviously going to be gone a lot. So he's going to be traveling to Boston a lot. He's going to be traveling to Philadelphia. And so the way that they will continue keeping their connection is through letters. So we just have volumes and volumes of letters. And she would often kind of tell him what to do. He would ask for her opinion. He really depended on her guidance. And she had a brilliant political mind. There are a lot of historians, including David McCullough, who is the expert on the Adamses, that if this was in a modern time, she could have run for president. So that's how intelligent she was, and had a great deal of ambition for herself. But this is a complete departure from a typical colonial marriage in this time period, especially of politicians. A politician's wife is going to be more of, the social type of hostess and that sort of thing. She was a fervent defender of independence, just like John. And while John is at the Second Continental Congress and, the formation of our government is in full swing, she writes her most famous letter to him. And this is called Remember the Ladies. This is on the AP test virtually every year. So that's why we're going to go through this. So this is just one part of it here, but she says, and by the way, in this new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. So she's really kind of throwing down the gauntlet here and saying, you husbands can be just as bad as the King Georges of the world. As you can imagine, he takes offense to a great deal of that particular letter. And so what she's really referring to here is something called coverture. So this is definitely a term you need to know. So this is legal doctrine, which basically says that women don't exist. They do not exist in terms of legal status. So women go from being property of their father to being property of their husband. So she is subsumed within the man's legal status. So for example, she can't own property, but the husband can. So if any kind of property was to come her way, it would automatically be transferred to her husband. Again, the exception here would be certain widows in your southern colonies. Women don't sign legal documents, again, because they are not a legal entity. They can't gain education without consent of their families. Any money they earn, if they're taking up sewing projects or anything like that, all of that money goes to the husband. So this is really what she's responding to. And usually the way that students misinterpret this excerpt is that they think she's talking about giving women the right to vote. And that's not it. That's not what she's referring to. She's referring to legal protections for women. So it does not change with the revolution. This is one piece of evidence that we have when we're trying to answer that question. To what extent was the American Revolution revolutionary? You don't see much change for women under this new regime. So John does not listen, not even a little. And in fact, he really kind of makes fun of her in his next letter and talks about the despotism of the petticoat. But it does bring in this new ideology, and that is the idea of Republican motherhood, which again is a fluency fact that tends to cause students a little bit of confusion. So that's why we're going through this in quite a bit of detail. So this is an ideology that's emerging, but keep in mind the terminology isn't put onto this idea until much later. But this is the time period that we're talking about here, 1770s to the 1830s. We're right back to our Enlightenment thinkers once again. We just can't get rid of those guys. So definitely inspired by Locke, definitely inspired by Wollstonecraft as well, but it's not quite as dramatic as her ideas. If you think back to, if you studied Wollstonecraft in your previous classes, she talked a lot about the importance of education for women, not just because they'd be educating other people in their role as mother, but because they are human beings and they deserve to be educated to be active citizens in their society. But that's not what this is. So Republican motherhood is the idea that women should be educated because one day they might give birth to a boy. And a boy needs to be educated in the ways of the Republic. So this is not Republican like Republican Party. This is like the Republic, a type of rule. So that's the idea, is that women need to be educated so they can educate the next generation of leaders. It's seen as their civic duty to instruct their sons. This is not going to be impacting your lower class women, women of color by any means. This is your kind of your ladies of leisure kind of group. So middle and upper class white women. But it does give women access to education and a role in the Republic. And that is a really big shift. Okay, and there is your card. So feel free to pause on that and add that to your ever-growing stash of fluency fact cards. And note the time range there, 1770s to the 1830s, and that this is concentrated in the Northeast. So think of those areas like Massachusetts. So now an interesting question that historians tend to grapple with is this feminism? So again, keep in mind, this terminology is largely a 20th century construct. The term isn't in fact used until 1976. I think most historians would agree that this is not feminism, not quite there yet. If it was more along the ideas of Wollstonecraft's ideas, then you might be able to make more of an argument there. But because they're only given this opportunity because they might give birth to sons, that's not quite in line with feminism. If you're looking for further resources, so there's definitely some links in your documents. There's an article from The Atlantic from the last election, so about fear of a female president. So this is going to be focusing on Hillary Clinton. And then there's a document there on, there's a woman who actually has her name on the Declaration of Independence. So take a look at that if you want to know her story. And then there's a video from Carol Birkin. So she is a colonial expert. She's a women's history expert as well. And so she has written some really great books on this topic. And so check that out if you want a little bit more on this. And if you want to go even further down the rabbit hole, there's some more here. So you can see the longer excerpt from Remember the Ladies, and then another document there from Judith Sargent Murray, who is another advocate for women's education. So you can take a look at that if you're interested. And if you want to do some document practice, that's there for you as well. So that ushers us into what we call the critical period. And so 1783 to 1789, you can see in the image here, we're in this boat together. We've got all of these colonies or states now in this boat. Congress is at the back and just can't do anything. So this really tells us we're in the age of the Articles of Confederation. The states are steering this boat. And if they're not careful, they're going to go straight into the rocks or go careening into anarchy. So context and background for the Articles. So 1777, this is the point where we are no longer calling ourselves colonies, but we are now states. Colonists are fighting to free themselves from this very large central government of Great Britain. So this is important context for the decisions that we end up making. So we want to protect the rights and the power of the states versus the central government. But we need some sort of loose organization to keep things running somewhat smoothly. This is one way to think about all of our three different documents here. And you can think about them in terms of their purpose. So the purpose of the Declaration is we're removing ourselves from this relationship with Great Britain, and we're securing the rights of the individual from government. Purpose of the Articles, setting up a national government that does not infringe on those rights that we laid out in the Declaration. And then finally, the Constitution. Its purpose is to secure the power of the government over individuals. Because what we find out is there's some issues with the Articles. There are some pieces of it that work well, but a lot that don't. Okay, so this is a confederal system model. So this is the type of model that we are in under the Articles. Okay, so note that states have power over citizens, but the central government does not. So you see there's no arrow coming from the central government to the citizens. Okay, so the states hold all the power. The states are impressing their power on the central government and the citizens. Under the federal system, it's a little bit different. Okay, so in that type of system that we're under, we have power exerted upon us as citizens from both states and the central government. And so that's why we had the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to lay out exactly what those were going to look like. So again, there's good and bad things here about the Articles. This is a really common kind of compare contrast type of essay prompt, comparing the Articles with the Constitution. So keep that in mind. Okay, so you have this chart in your document, and we're going to watch a short clip from our pal John Green. I know we all love John Green, and just fill that chart in as you go, and just expect to see or kind of share what you come up with when you go back into class the next time we see you. So in what ways were the Articles effective, and in which ways were they not effective? So this is a to what extent kind of question.
This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about the United States Constitution. And in doing so, we're going to explore how the American style of government became the envy of the entire world, so much so that everyone else copied us. What's that, Sam? We're not going to talk about other countries stealing our form of government because no other country stole our form of government? That doesn't seem possible, Sam. about the Libertage, cue the intro. So today we're going to learn why the green areas of non-America didn't copy us. All right, so as Americans may dimly remember from history classes, the constitutional system we've been living under since 1788, the year of the first presidential election, was not the original American government. The first government set up by the Continental Congress was called the Articles of Confederation, and it was, in a word, bad. In 2 words, it was not good, which is why it only lasted 10 years. The problem with the Confederation is that it wasn't so much a framework for a national government as it was a firm league of friendship, which unfortunately only sounds like a team of Care Bear superheroes. The Articles set up a government that consisted of a one-house body of delegates, with each state having a single vote, who, acting collectively, could make decisions on certain issues that affected all the states. There was no president and no judiciary. You can try to tell me that John Hanson, the president of the Congress, was the first American president, but it's just not true. Any decision required 9 of the 13 congressional votes, which pretty much guaranteed that no decisions would ever be made. Supermajorities, always so efficient. But besides the 2/3 requirement, the Congress was very limited in what it could actually do. The government could declare war, conduct foreign affairs, and make treaties. Basically the stuff you need to do to go to war with England. It could coin money, but it couldn't collect taxes. That was left to the states. So if you needed money to, say, go to war with Britain, you had to ask the states politely. The Articles could be amended, but that required a unanimous vote, so 0 amendments were ever passed. The government was deliberately weak, which followed logically from Americans' fear of tyrannical governments taxing them and quartering soldiers in their houses and so on. But here's the thing, weak government is like non-alcoholic beer. It's useless. That said, the Articles government did accomplish a couple things. First, it won the war, so yay! Unless you were a slave or a Native American, in which case, probable boo. Second, the government developed rules for dealing with one of the most persistent problems facing the new nation, Ohio, which was called the Northwest, presumably because it is north and west of Virginia. Getting control of the land meant taking it from the Indians who were living there, and the Articles government was empowered to make treaties, which it did. Crash Course World History fans will remember the Athenians telling the Melians that the strong do as they can and the weak suffer what they must. And the Americans definitely went to the Athenian school of treaty making. Through a treaty signed at Fort Stanwix and Fort McIntosh, the Indians surrendered land north of the Ohio River. The biggest accomplishment of the Articles government was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which set up a process to create 5 new states between the Ohio and Mississippi River. 2 things to know about this. First, it acknowledged that American Indians had a claim to the land and that they had to be treated better if settlers wanted to avoid violence. And second, Stan, can I get the foreshadowing filter? Yes, perfect. The ordinance outlawed slavery in all 5 of the new states. Still, the Articles government was a complete disaster for exactly one reason. It could not collect taxes. Both the national government and the individual states had racked up massive debt to pay for the war, and their main source of revenue became tariffs. But because Congress couldn't impose them, states had to do it individually. And this made international trade a total nightmare. In fact, worsened by the British being kind of cranky about us winning the war and therefore unwilling to trade with us. In 1786 and 1787, the problem got so bad in Massachusetts that farmers rose up and closed the courts to prevent them from foreclosing upon their debt-encumbered farm. This was called Shays' Rebellion after Revolutionary War veteran and indebted farmer Daniel Shays. The uprising was quelled by the state militia, but for many, this was the sign that the Articles government, which couldn't deal with the crisis at all, had to go. But not for everyone. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, was a fan of Shays' Rebellion. A little rebellion now and then is a good thing. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Which is all fine and good, unless you're the bleeding patriots or tyrants. But to most elites, Shays' Rebellion showed that too much democratic liberty among the lower classes could threaten private property. Also, people who held government bonds were nervous because without tax revenue, they were unlikely to get paid back. And when rich people feel like something has to be done, something is usually done.
Okay, so the rest of that is going to be taking you into the Constitution, which we will deal with in class next time we see you. Okay, so again, make sure on your chart you've got at least a few things on each side. So something that the Articles did well and things that the Articles did not do well. So we definitely expect to see the taxation issues as an inefficiency, that all had to come from the state. So that was a giant disaster, especially as far as international trade was concerned. We'll dig more into Shays' Rebellion a little bit later as well, but that definitely raises the specter of the mob. And that was the other inefficiency of the Articles, is that there was no national military. So the national government would basically have to go around to the states and say, pretty please, will you raise an army and stop the scary mad farmers from shutting down Massachusetts? So again, more on that a little bit later. But one of the great things about the Northwest Ordinance is this is one of the really solid things that we have under the Articles. So John Green gave us a nice little introduction to that. So new land that is coming in, so we're going to be making new states. And any of these new states is going to be equal to the original colonies. They're going to have the same rights, same stipulations. So this is a big deal. It does allow for expansion. This is going to be really important as we go down the line, especially in Unit 4. And it gives us a process, a procedure. And there are going to be no slavery in these new states. So Ohio River becomes the boundary between slave and free states. Now you'll see as we go down Units 4 and 5, we definitely get away from this process. So eventually states will be able to decide whether or not they are free or slave states. It also says that if you're going to buy land from natives, you have to pay for it. You can't just take it. So fair dealings in dealings with the Native Americans. So again, this is a big success for the Articles. Just so that you know what this process looks like, it's a 3-step process. So, and we'll get through this as we add more and more states, especially when Louisiana Territory kind of falls into our lap. So the first stage is a territory. So you start kind of getting people on this particular land. And when the adult male population reaches a certain amount, you can elect representatives, and then they can start working on documents. So if their total population is over 60,000, they can apply for statehood. And again, same deal, they'll come into the union with all rights and privileges equal to the original 13. Again, there's your fluency fact card for the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. I've got another nice one that has the year in the title. We always like those. But again, make sure that you've got that this is Ohio. And the big significant piece here is that this is one of the key successes of the Articles. Keep in mind, not everyone is so enamored with this. Native Americans are not going to be a big fan, even though you might think, well, they're finally getting some fair dealing, so what's the problem? The problem is you're going to have a lot more white settlers coming into their region. So you're going to see some aggressive tribes like the Shawnee and the Miami tribes just start basically attacking any settlers that are coming into the region. And so as a result, militias are raised, and there's going to be battles that are going to be happening here. So 2 different militias are raised and both defeated. So that is equivalent to 800 dead Americans. So Washington is going to raise a federal army, and he sends Anthony Wayne, known as Mad Anthony Wayne. And so they defeat the tribes at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. Note that this is happening under the Constitution, so that's why Washington is able to raise a federal army. If this was before the Constitution, he would have had to go around to the surrounding states and ask them to raise their own militias. So you'll see the Treaty of Greenville that is set up in response to the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. So artistic rendering of this battle here. Again, this is the location that we're talking about here, and that is Mad Anthony Wayne. All right, that's all for the content. Make sure that you go to your USHAP teacher's Canvas page and do the thesis practice. So 1 to 2 sentence thesis addressing all parts of this prompt and weighing both sides. So to what extent were the Articles of Confederation effective? So again, when you've got a prompt like this, you have to show both sides. So to what extent are the Articles effective, and to what extent are they not effective? Thanks for tuning in, guys, and we'll talk to you next time.